Hello, hello, welcome to Mindset to Results. Today we have Henry Yampolski, who is the guest at
Mhm.
our show, and we will discuss very important topic, and it is responding to conflict with clarity, strength, and compassion. Hi, Henry.
Hello, Elena. How are you?
I am great. It was great to know that you are from Ukraine, where we would meet.
Yes. I am from Ukraine. I came to the United States in 1994. So I've been living in the U.S. for a very long time. But I am originally from Ukraine, from Kiev.
Yeah, very good to know that. Yeah, so let's discuss this important topic for driven business owners and entrepreneurs because conflicts can happen. Yes, they happen, and it is so important to know how we can transform the conflict to the situation with compassion, clarity, and strength. Yeah,
Mhm.
so let's start from sharing about you. Tell us a little bit about you, what you do, and how did you come to this, what you do now?
Mhm. Yes, it was quite a journey. So Elena, as I mentioned, I came originally from Ukraine to the United States. I was 14 in 1994. And life for me and my parents was quite difficult. We lived in a relatively small town in Pennsylvania, where just very few immigrants in this town. And so I thought if I'd become a lawyer, I could be the voice for people like my parents. And so I became a lawyer. And for many years, I practiced law in Philadelphia. I did a lot of work with civil rights and labor employment. But after about seven or 8 years of practice, I came to a point where I was quite burned out, and also where to a point where I was very frustrated with the system, the traditional, British, Anglo-Saxon system of laws and courts, because I thought it was quite violent. I thought it was quite binary. I thought it was very difficult to truly hear someone's voice. Everything was based in power and all of those things. And so then it was at that time, Elena, that I started searching for different and alternative ways to approach conflict, to approach even my work as a lawyer. And through a series of transformative events, personally transformative events, I ended up in India. And India has had a very profound and deep influence on me. At this point, I've been there 20 times. I connected very deeply with Gandhi's teachings on nonviolence. I connected very deeply with traditional yogic teachings on conflict. And that began to shape what I ended up doing. So it was after my first trip to India that I started trainings in mediation. I completed a number of trainings in mediation, collaborative law, coaching, different approaches and different ways to approach conflict. And through that, through my experiences in India, through my personal spiritual practice, which developed from this experience, emerged an approach to conflict transformation that I see as very integral to transforming our conflict interactions. And this approach ultimately is the most important aspect of this is not what we do in conflict, but actually how we show up, how we show up. And so as a result of this work, and as a result, my personal spiritual practice is a result of really going very deep into a lot of the Eastern teachings on conflict. I developed, or really, maybe develop is not the right word. I communicated four principles of conflict transformation, which enable us to shift our conflict interactions and to shift from reacting to conflict with fear, with avoidance, with aggression, to responding with strength, with clarity, and with compassion.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience. It is very interesting how different cultures Yes, give opportunities to look at things from different perspective. Yeah,
Hmm.
it took you to go to India outside of your environment to find different perspectives, yeah, different way how to look at conflict situation. So let's speak about the causes. What you think are the causes of conflicts?
Mm. You see, causes and ultimately, I view conflict very, very broadly. And I will suggest, Elena, that what causes conflict is really anything that changes our story. Because we process life through narrative. Ultimately, we have a narrative that we run all the time, right? And that's how we process. We process life by telling a narrative about it. And so conflict really is anything that challenges our narrative. And here, Elena, we also need to make a distinction between reacting and responding, because in English we tend to use these words interchangeably. And I want to suggest that actually they have very, very different meanings. So, what is a reaction? Reaction is our attempt to escape or control whoever or whatever is triggering us. So whenever our story is challenged, most of the time, actually, even from the perspective of neuropsychology, the brain activity transitions from the prefrontal cortex, which is the largest part of our brain, to the brain stem. And our brain stem is really capable of kind of pre-programmed fight or flight type reactions. And that's the nature of the reaction. It's essentially a software. It's something that we are conditioned to do, and it's escape or control whoever or whatever is triggering us. So then what is a response? Response is an action that is appropriate for the situation, which arises from an undisturbed state. So, key here is not actually what we do, but where the doing is coming from, what state we're in. And to give you an example, and to give you listeners an example, Elena, suppose when we're dealing with a 2 or 3 year old child, a 2 or 3 year old child is a child that is fascinating because that's the age that children learn that people have buttons. And, if you press different combinations of buttons, sometimes fun things happen, sometimes not so fun things happen. And so they're experimenting, right? They try to press different buttons and see what will happen. So let's say you're with a 2 or 3 year old child, and maybe the child is doing something, and you are looking at this, and you can say, wow, what they're doing is kind of clever, right? It takes some ingenuity, it takes some understanding, it takes some planning. But then maybe as an adult, you have to raise your voice, or you have to bring the child back, just to set that boundary. But actually, you're really not mad. You're not mad. You're not angry at that child. You're not going to stop loving that child. But maybe for purposes of the situation, you need to take the appropriate action where you act angry or mad. And that's the nature of a response. There is clarity, there is ease, there is peace, and even possibly joy inside as we take the action that is necessary and appropriate for the situation. And that's the nature of the response. And in much of my work, what I do is really help people to move from reacting to conflict to responding.
Yeah, so true. Because reacting, it doesn't take thinking process. It is just automatic reaction. Why it is called reacting? Because it just
Mhm.
happens on autopilot. And if people react
Mhm.
without thinking what they're doing or what they're saying, they can hurt somebody. They can do something bad that they will regret later. Yeah. So when responding, we think first. Yeah, we think first and think like what is the best way to
Mhm.
address this situation, and then we respond from the place how we want the situation to be handled. Yeah, and this is as for me it's such a big difference between reacting and responding. Usually people react just based on their five senses. Yes, this ability to see, hear, taste, and smell and touch. And this is how people usually live, based on just physical senses. And they just react like machines, like computer, yeah, or action reaction, or
Right.
animals. Yes, but what makes people really be the highest form of creation, which are humans supposed to be? Yes, it is using their high mental faculties, such as reasoning, yes, perception, ability to look at the situation from different point of view, and then respond. Yes, not just react without reasoning. This is also so big difference between people and animals: ability to reason, to think, and also to solve situation with compassion. Yes, understanding and thinking why that person did that. It also makes very big difference in conflict solving.
Yes. Could I actually maybe challenge something that you said just a little bit? Because it's not, I want to make clear the difference between reaction and response is not just a thought, right? Thoughts can be quite compulsive too. It's where the thoughts are coming from. So we go even to some extent, we need to go beyond thought, right? It's not just that we think about something, because again, if our thoughts can be just as reactive as our actions. It's not just that in responding, we think. It's in responding, we're acting from a different space, right? From a space of ease. And from that space, it's more than just thinking. And this is, Helena, where we start getting into 4 principles of conflict transformation. And this is really becomes very, very essential for this. So what are the 4 principles of conflict transformation? First one is tuning inward. Tuning inward. Now, tuning inward is not thinking. It's not thinking. Tuning inward is actually where we talk about mindfulness. However, very Western idea of mindfulness is that we do mindfulness to feel better, right? We do meditation, we do yoga to feel better. My invitation is that we start doing this to get better at feeling. So actually, we're able to be with whatever is arising. Whatever is arising. Sometimes it's pleasant, sometimes it's not. Whatever is happening, whatever is the situation happening, first we're just able to tune in and be with it. Be with it without trying to fix it, without trying to change it, without trying to even analyze it. Just be with this. Really tune in and connect with our feelings, with our values. And if we're talking about even on organizational levels, this is what I even work with organizations and in companies, tuning inward. What is truly important? Who are we? Who are we as an organization? Who are we as this community? What are our core values? Now, after tuning inward, where we go in the second principle is observation without evaluation. Observation without evaluation. Fundamentally, this is about how we listen. The purest form of observation without evaluation is listening. So if we want to transform our conflict interactions, and one of the first and most important skills that I teach my students is how to listen. How to listen, where listening itself becomes a spiritual practice. Now, most of us, if we're really honest, when we are engaging with other people, and especially if the engagement in any way challenges us, we actually are not listening to the person, we're listening to our narrative, our story of the person. Once we once we do tuning inward and we develop that awareness between actually listening to what the person is saying and listening to our story of that person, that can fundamentally shift how we engage with people. The third principle is expansion. The third principle is expansion. When we are in conflict, our focus becomes very narrow. We're focused on past grievance or on future anxiety. And very often we don't see anything else. Expansion means also we start moving from positions, because most of our interactions are purely positional. And especially now in this day and age when we tend to be so reductionist, most of our interactions are purely positional, meaning someone states a position and before they're done, they're already being attacked. They're already being called a name. And we need to expand, move from positions to and through interests, to and through emotions, to and through values, and finally, and most importantly, to needs. So understanding the true needs in conflict. And final principle is exploration. And this is where we engage with curiosity, bring in curiosity into conflict, and also engage with complexity, nuance, ambiguity, uncertainty inherent in every single one of us as human beings, and therefore inherent in every single one of our human interactions.
Yes, it is very deep, profound understanding the difference between reaction and response.
Mm-hmm.
So how can people can implement this in practice?
Sure, sure. So I think in terms of implementing this in practice, actually, what I will say to my students and what I will say to most people that I work with, actually, one of the most important tools of conflict transformation, this is where we start with the very first step, right? With the very first principle, tuning inward. One of the most important tools of conflict transformation is breath. And I didn't misspeak. I didn't have anything funny for lunch. What I said is exactly what I mean. It's breath. Why? Because most of the time, we have no control of what someone else is doing. What is the biggest difference in term between reacting and responding? It's how we are, right? It's how we are in that moment. So, Elena, if you would like, I'm happy to share with your listeners a very, very simple breathing technique that can help us shift how we are in a conflict situation. Because ultimately, what we are trying to do in a conflict situation is to create some space between whatever is the situation and us. Here's why we're trying to create space. If I take my glasses off for a moment and I take my hand and I put it right against my face, right against my eyes, can I see anything? I just see a blur, right?
Mhm.
But if I do this, there's a little bit of space I can examine. I can see how my hand moves. And so, in having some space, there is a capacity to respond. That becomes one of the most important important ways. You know, there's an ancient mystic poet, Rumi, Persian poet, who talks about there is a space beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there. First, we have to connect with that space within us, and then everything else arises from that space. So, Elena, what I would like to do is invite your listeners and you to try to practice this little technique with me. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely, with pleasure.
Okay. Okay. So, Elena, I'm going to invite you to you and your listeners to come into a comfortable seated position. And so, comfortable seated position, if you're sitting in a chair, moving a little bit closer to the edge. Now, why we're doing that? We're doing that, first of all, we're excited to learn something new, right? We're on the edge of our seat. And also, certainly, I'm speaking with you from the United States. So here it's right around lunchtime. I think you're in England, right? So it's a little bit later in the evening there. And we don't want to, the point here is not to fall asleep, right? The point here is to develop a certain level of awareness. And so, Elena, also, if you can, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and to tune into your breath. Notice the colder air entering the nostrils. Notice the warmer air leaving. And Elena, I'm going to invite you to consciously make your breath deeper so that the breath travels to and through the chest, to and through the stomach, and to and through the pelvic floor. And Elena, I'm going to invite you also to pause as little as possible between each inhale and each exhale so that the breath can move in one smooth, continuous wave. Inhale transitions to exhale, exhale transitions to inhale. And Elena, we're going to use a very simple four-word English phrase to help us tune in. And the phrase is, I am here now. And we're going to combine this phrase with a breath. As you inhale, thinking of the word I, exhale, am. Inhale, here, exhale, now. So I invite you to practice this technique with me. I am here now. Breathing through the nose. Now, Elena, when you and your listeners are ready, I'm going to invite you and them to take a deep breath in through the nose and hold the breath at the conclusion of the inhale while focusing on the area in between your eyebrows. And then as you exhale fully through the mouth, gently blinking your eyes open. So let me ask you this, Elena. How did this feel to you?
Very relaxing.
Yes, yes. Now, people will ask me, so Henry, when are we supposed to do this? Before, during, or after conflict? The answer is yes. We should be breathing all the time. But the key here, and as we're breathing, we're going to ask two critical questions. We're going to ask and bring into awareness two critical questions. First, what is my intention? And second, what is the big picture? What is the big picture? So Elena, I'm going to share with you how actually I utilize this very technique in conflict scenario, in a potential conflict scenario, and how it helped me to move from reacting to responding. So Elena, I actually work at a pretty major research university here in the United States, Virginia Tech in Virginia. And I work with faculty and staff, and I direct our internal conflict resolution program for faculty and staff on issues that deal with various civil rights and equity concerns. So several weeks ago, it was Friday afternoon, and someone emailed me, and it was Friday afternoon. I was tired after a long week. I opened their email, and as I read this email, my immediate reaction was, "Who do you think you are?" I didn't like the tone of the email. I thought it was very, very accusatory. And I was ready, right? That this person was sarcastic. So I thought, okay, you think you're clever? Well, let me show you, right? And then, Elena, I remembered what sometimes my loved ones say to me when they're frustrated with me. Do you know what my loved ones say to me when they're frustrated with me? Elena, they say to me, Henry, have you considered reading your book? Also, maybe attend some of your trainings, you know, some useful things there. So I remembered, what would Henry say, right? So I took just a few moments and I practiced this breathing technique. And by the way, we can even practice this with eyes open, right? It's easier with your eyes closed. Just, I am here now. And then I reread the email. And someone must have done something very sneaky. As I had my eyes closed and I was breathing, they must have snuck into my office and changed the whole email. Because when I read it the second time after breathing, I saw it completely differently. Yes, the person was frustrated. They weren't frustrated with me. They were frustrated with the situation. So then, Elena, I asked the two critical questions that I'm talking about. What is my intention? Because the key in conflict, the key in responding to conflict is that all of our interactions become intentional, not merely compulsive or accidental. And that's not just thought, because again, our thoughts can be compulsive and accidental, right? Very much so. So this is really making, especially when we're engaging in interaction, right? What is our intention? And if we're not clear about our intention, why are we engaging? Right? Why are we engaging if we're not clear about our intention? So that's my question. What is my intention? Well, my intention, I'm a mediator. This person is coming to me for help. I want to help them. So if I send a snarkly response back or reaction back to their email, would it actually help? Of course, the answer is no. And then I said, okay, well, what is the big picture here? What is the big picture here? And the big picture here, was this the person was operating within some very difficult power structures. And this person was from a foreign country and they didn't fully understand these power structures. So again, I could make these power structures worse or I could make them better. So just breathing and taking those few moments for me to ask those two questions. What is my intention? What is the big picture? Dramatically changed this situation and whether I would have reacted to it and send, maybe a clever, snarkly email back, or now having the capacity to respond and looking at this a little bit deeper. And because, Elena, so many of your clients are businesses, right, where maybe they're also dealing with this on an organizational level, I want to suggest that on an organizational level, when we engage with conflict, before we do anything, first step is also to tune in. Now, obviously, at an organizational level, we're not necessarily doing breathing. But what we are doing on an organizational level is we try to tune in to what is truly important for us. Who are we as an organization? What are our core values? What do they actually mean? Because once we're connected with that, then we can respond from our values, right? Which responds from the values, where we invoke the values, that's always going to be deeper, more profound, more long-term, and more strategic. That's something where we just merely react. Now, in terms of the next, do you want me to pause here? Do you have a question, or should I go on to kind of the next skill?
Yeah, you can go on. Yeah, this is really very interesting and profound. Yes, thank you for sharing.
Of course, of course.
Yeah. Yes, and what I wanted just to tell that just reflecting on what you just shared, that response also involves compassion. Yes, like when you start looking at the situation with compassion, as you said that you took into consideration that the person was foreigner, that the person didn't understand many things, then how it also helps to really help the situation. Yes, and the second moment, what I also noticed that you took yourself out of equation and you see the situation as a whole, and you see like you are, what is your role there, that you don't take that situation personally as that person wrote to you and wanted to be rude, but you look as you are there for what reason, what is your role there, and you respond also through that role. That makes difference.
Mhm. So, Elaine, I'm so glad you brought up and reminded me about compassion, because compassion here is very, very important. And I want to define compassion, because we tend to use empathy, things like empathy and compassion interchangeably. And I want to actually distinguish the two, because that's very important, right? Because here Elena, and actually in doing this work and doing this work around the world, what I realized is that we know a lot less about other people than we think we do. We know a lot less about other people than we think we do. And so from that, I want to suggest that the idea that we can be in another person's shoes is an illusion, right? Elena, you and I both come from the same country, the same place. So we probably have similar conditioning, I'm going to suspect, in many ways, right? Having been born in Ukraine, having been born in, for you, Eastern Ukraine, from you, Kiev, being influenced by Russian and Ukrainian culture growing up, all of that. And yet, can I truly, even if we're coming from the same culture, from the same space, can I truly say that I could be in your shoes? And the answer
No.
is no, right? And it's kind of dangerous for me,
Mm.
middle-aged, cisgender white male, to assume that just if you and I live through the same experience, my experience of that experience and your experience of that experience are the same, and
Mm.
impact is the same. So actually, compassion is not about being in another person's shoes. The way I define compassion is first, deep, infinite connection with another person's humanity, right? So there's no them, there's only us. And this is in many ways where we start going beyond identities. Because our identities, Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, American, British, in some ways, these identities are boundaries, right? This can say, okay, this is mine, this is yours.
Create separation. Yes, all this creates.
Create separations, and like with all boundaries, right? In some ways, they can define us, and like with all boundaries, there comes a time when they start to limit and confine us.
Mhm.
So first, piece of compassion is deep, infinite connection with another person's humanity. And then that is combined with the knowledge that we can never truly experience or know what someone has lived through. So there is radical inclusion, right? We don't see people as them. There's only us, right? It's only us. We see their humanity. And also we say, you know what? And I don't know their experience. Because if I don't know someone else's experience, then naturally we start engaging and naturally we start asking, right? Tell me, help me understand. Help me understand what your experience is. If I assume that I know your experience, right? If I assume that I know what's better for you, that's where we get immense violence that we see now in the world. Why is so much violence happening? Why is the war happening in our country, right? On a more spiritual, on a more fundamental level, somebody thinks that they know what's best for 38 million people of Ukraine, right? I know better. That's where that assumption comes from that separation and from that idea. I know better what someone else needs. But if I say I don't know these people's experience, I need to engage with them, I have to be careful in assuming, then we are in compassion.
Yes, asking and having ability to hear. Yes,
Yes.
ability to hear and understand other people's perspectives.
Yes, which brings us actually, Elena, to the second principle, to observation without evaluation. And what I would like to share with you and with your listeners is the second most important tool of conflict transformation. Remember, the first one is the breath. The first one is having that spiritual inner practice, that mindfulness practice, so that we're tuning inward and tuning inward. And so naturally, we become more accepting. Naturally, we become more curious. Naturally, we become more intentional in all of our actions. That's something that naturally starts to happen when we have that. And that's why it's so critical. Almost every day, I spend 2 hours doing meditation. I do this just so that I'm fit for human consumption. And that allows me to be able to, by tuning into myself, I'm able to tune into other people. I'm able to just naturally be less reactive. I'm naturally more curious, more open, more accepting, etc. So
Ground.
observation without evaluation, and that's where we're going to talk about listening. And that's the number two skill of conflict transformation. And I will say this to my students, I will say to a lot of folks that I'm working with, if we know how to listen, best leaders are not necessarily always, best managers, truly amazing transformational leaders. First and foremost, are amazing listeners. Would you agree?
Yeah.
All right.
Definitely.
So let me talk about listening and 4 dimensions of compassionate listening, because again, if we're talking about compassion, right, and as we define compassion as deep, infinite connection with another person's humanity, combined with the knowledge that we can never truly experience or know what someone has lived through. So now, how do we bring this into action? And we're going to bring this into action by listening. So how do we listen? So first, listening is a physical process. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Listening is
it's
a
active. Active.
physical process.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we do this? So Yelena, I'm going to ask you to do something physical, because that will illustrate something very important about this process. So Yelena, I'm going to ask you to take your tongue and fold it so it forms this kind of semicircle. You don't do it with your hand, you just do it with your tongue. Okay, with your tongue. Okay, I'm just illustrating with my hand. So now you're doing it. Try to say your name.
I really know.
All right. So it becomes a little bit more difficult. So this is actually you've heard the phrase biting your tongue, right? I was biting my tongue to say. Have you heard the phrase? Yes. Like
Yeah.
I was gonna have you and your listeners bite their tongue, but then I thought, if the headline is people are bleeding after listening to Yelena's podcast, that's not a good headline. So we're gonna fold the tongue. Why are we doing this? And this is something that I learned in the Himalayas. This is what Buddhist monks would do when they were listening to their master. Because actually, very intentionally, we're closing off the speaking channel while opening the listening one. So again, if everything we're trying to do is to be intentional, right? We're creating a physical reminder. We're creating a physical reminder, right? That now we have to do actually something physical to open our mouth. So some other physical dimensions of listening, it's very important, and I'm very intentional when I listen to other people, and especially when this is maybe something a little bit more challenging, more difficult, that my chest is as open as possible, right? That at least from the Western perspective, and Western, I mean Anglo-Saxon, right? Britain, US, North America, there is direct eye contact. This is something that's very valued. Direct eye contact. Because if I'm doing this, right, and you're talking, I'm immediately already sending a message to you that I'm not here with you, right? Just also what you're doing just right now, right? Supportive nods of the head. Yes, I'm listening, right? I am with you. So these are all physical dimensions of listening. Second aspect, second dimension. So first one is physical, right? Folding the tongue, open chest, supportive nods of the head, or something else that I invite people to avoid. It's very common in the West for people to sit like this. Have you seen?
Yeah.
Yes, right? If
Yeah.
you and I were in the same room, it would be very and let's say the room got a little chilly. It would be very natural for us to go like this. Why? We're preventing the outside from entering us, right?
Yeah.
And we're also inadvertently closing us, right? Like, look, my spine rolls in, right? Naturally, kind of my body closes. So what is the message we're sending? The message we're sending is I am not actually open to hear what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
The chest open, direct eye contact, supportive nods of the head. Second dimension of compassionate listening. We're going to notice all the times we want to interrupt the speaker, to ask a follow-up question, to defend ourselves, to say the same thing happened to us or to our cousin. We're going to notice that, and then here we have to bite our tongue if we need to, just so that we remember not to interrupt. This is especially critical when the conversation is more challenging, when we are in the midst of conflict. We're going to listen first before trying to interrupt.
Mhm.
Third dimension of compassionate listening. Third dimension of compassionate listening. What are we listening for? Yes, words are important. What's even more important than words, however, is energy, emotion, and intensity behind the words, right? That's what gives words meaning. That's what gives words meaning. It's that energy, emotion, intensity, and I would even add cultural context for the words, right? Because we're living and operating within a global environment. And of course, a great example of that, the two languages that you and I are probably most familiar with, right? Russian and Ukrainian, both have many words that describe suffering, right? And actually very few words that describe joy. That's a cultural context, right? And tell me if I'm getting this wrong. The final dimension of compassionate listening, and this is very important, we're going to summarize the general gist of what the person had said. And then we're going to use our voice and our body to try to capture that energy, emotion, and intensity. Now, sometimes this is where my students will say to me, Henry, do you mean to tell us that if someone is yelling, we yell back? The answer is no. However, if someone is really animated, and they're using their hands and they're talking like this, and I reflect and say what they said in this very monotone voice, right? There's going to be a mismatch. There's going to be a mismatch. So if someone is very, very animated and maybe they're at a 10, I will meet them at a 7, but not at a 3. But not at a And something that's very, very critical, Elena, as we are listening to people, we're also asked two critical questions. Am I hearing what people intended me to hear? Are people hearing what I intended them to hear? Because again, so often we're listening not to the person, but to our story of the person. And this is where, by summarizing the general gist of what the person is saying, we can actually check in and say, is this what you're saying? Is this what I'm hearing you say? Right now, this is not the same as validating. We don't have to agree. We don't have to validate. We just have to understand what the person is saying, right? And then so often, again, let's say you and I had a conflict, and I start saying something, well, because you and I had a conflict, you're not necessarily going to be listening to me. You're going to be listening to your story of me. So if I say to you, Elena, could you summarize what you think you heard me say? And as I hear you summarize, I may realize, what, Elena, sorry, that's not what I said at all, or that's not what I meant at all. Okay? Now, the next principle, Elena, the next principle is expansion. And this is, as I said, where we move. And I very often talk about how most of our interactions, and I use an iceberg to illustrate this. Most of our interactions are kind of at the tip of the iceberg, which is our positions, which is the most superficial level. And we never go beyond that. We never engage with interests, which is why we hold the positions. We never engage with emotions, right, which give the color to everything that is happening with us. We very rarely get to values, and almost never do we get to needs, right? Almost never do we get to needs. And even when we're dealing with international conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, all of those, until and unless we're able to get to the underlying needs of the people involved, we're getting nowhere in any kind of negotiations. We're getting nowhere in any kind of negotiations until there is a deep acknowledgement of the needs, very human needs, right, of all the groups represented, of all the people represented in this conflict. So how do we get from positions to needs? How do we get from positions to needs? One of the very, very important aspects of conflict transformation is asking questions. Asking questions. This is how we start moving from positions to and through needs. And one of the most important questions we can ask, Elena, is not a question that we ask another party. One of the most important questions and one of the most transformative questions in conflict we can ask is a question we ask ourselves. And the question we ask ourselves is, what is it about this person or their situation that I don't know? What is it about this person or their situation that I don't know? Right? Because the moment I ask this question, I have a million questions. Now I have a million questions. Because see, in Western culture, we tend to focus on what we know. We tend to focus on knowledge. We tend to value knowledge, right? Our knowledge, however, is always going to be limited. Our ignorance is limitless. I'd rather focus on ignorance, right? If we focus on what we don't know. And as we ask what we don't know, we also ask, what is it that we do know, right? That we make this very clear distinction. What is it that we don't know? And what is it that we actually do know about the situation? Now, Elena, when we get to the final step, the step of exploration, this is where we bring curiosity into conflict, right? And curiosity is it's very difficult to be curious when we are afraid. Curiosity and fear don't mix well, right? And that's where that first step becomes so important, tuning inward, because the more we tune inward, the more we're able to identify what is truly arising for us and then shift fear into curiosity, and then move away from the binary. And in most conflicts, people will say, well, what is the binary, right versus wrong, right? That's actually not correct. How often do you get in conflict with other people when you think you're wrong? I'm wrong and I'm going to be in conflict with you. And the answer is no, right? It's you think you're right and I think I'm right. Russia thinks it's right and Ukraine thinks it's right, right? And there's a conflict. So it's right versus right. And we move away from that two-sided binary approach, and we start engaging with complexity, nuance, ambiguity, and uncertainty, inherent in every single one of us as human beings, and therefore inherent in every single one of our interactions. So, Elena, can I tell you and your listeners a story that really illustrates that? And
Yeah, definitely.
that illustrates how we engage that dimension. And that also brings us to another question, another powerful question that we ask, right? Because so often, so much about conflict transformation is about asking powerful questions, as you've been doing here. So this happened in the Middle East. This happened in the Middle East. Old man dies, and he leaves his entire inheritance to his 3 children. Now, his inheritance, Elena, consists of 17 camels. 17 camels. So he has 3 children. The oldest son, it's the Middle East. The oldest son is preferred. The oldest son gets one half of the inheritance, right? He has a middle son, and the middle son gets 1/3 of the inheritance. And then he has a daughter. And the daughter, well, what happens to daughters everywhere? Sometimes daughters, right, get the shorter end of the stick. So the daughter gets 1/9 of the inheritance. So, Elena, we have a problem, don't we? We have 17 camels, right? Is 17 divisible by 2? It's not. Is
No,
17 divisible by 3? It's
no.
not, right? Is 17 divisible by 9? It's not. So what to do? So siblings are arguing, they're developing a conflict. These things are escalating, other people are getting drawn in, people are taking sides, and they're getting nowhere. And finally, someone says, you ought to go see this wise woman in a neighboring village. Maybe she could help you. So the siblings at this point are desperate. They have nothing else to do. They go see this woman, and they're kind of unimpressed. All she's doing is just asking them some questions. She's listening, and then she says, I don't know if I could help you. Let me think about it. So a few days go by, and the woman shows up in the village where the siblings are living. And she's not showing up alone. She's bringing another camel with her, and she gathers the siblings and she says, look, I don't know if I could help you, but you know, my family has been very, very successful. I have this other camel that, you know, my family's not using. Maybe you could use it as well. So now the siblings have 18 camels. Now we're going to do some math. Right, Elena, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we have 18 camels. Okay, so 18 divided by 2.
9.
9. So the oldest brother gets 9 camels, right?
Mm.
18 divided by 3.
6.
6. And 18 divided by 9.
2.
Okay, so 9 plus 6 plus 2 is what?
It is 9 plus 6, 15, 17.
17. And that and this is conflict transformation, right? So what did the woman do here? She didn't tell the siblings what to do. She enabled them to look at the situation differently, where actually they realized that they had everything that they needed to from the start to resolve the situation. So what is the fundamental question that the woman asked? The fundamental question that the woman asked is, what is possible? What is possible? Because when we ask the question, what is possible, right? We engage our creativity. Otherwise, we operate within limited parameters of maybe what has happened before. The moment we ask the question, what is possible, we naturally expand, right? And then we can develop our creativity, and then we can brainstorm, and then we can do all these things that we're doing. And that's how we start bringing creativity in curiosity into conflict. We ask this question, what is possible?
Yeah, very interesting. I really appreciate such a good illustration of looking at things from different perspectives. Yes.
Mhm.
So when you something that can seem impossible to solve, when you
Mhm.
just change perspective, you can find the solution.
Mhm.
So this very wise to look at things from different perspectives and open your mind and see what is possible. Yeah, what can be solved, what solution can be found. Because
Right.
people just say, "Oh, it is impossible," like
Mhm.
as initially. 17 is impossible to divide by 3 or impossible to divide by 2, right? But when we look at in different perspective, it
Mhm.
becomes possible. Yes, so great example of this wisdom.
Yes, and Elena, and sometimes for us to get that perspective, and this is very important, we sometimes physically have to move space, right? Physically, we have to change our positions. We have to move. And this
Mhm.
is also sometimes, you know, when maybe when your clients, you know, are dealing with difficult negotiations, difficult conflicts, sometimes gaining a new perspective actually means we have to physically move to a different place, location, so that we can maybe see things differently. That sometimes can be very, very crucial. That sometimes could be very, very crucial in terms of how we think about a conflict situation.
Yes, I learned this from Napoleon Hill, where he
Yeah.
explained this principle of mastermind. Yes, and even like he said that somebody didn't have that mastermind, but he created it in his mind, and he invited uh, important people who didn't live already, like for example Abraham Lincoln or uh, Andrew Carnegie or
Mhm.
Thomas Edison, yes, and he was asking them questions, what they would say if they were at the table. So he mentally created the table and put there in his mind, imagination, all these people, and then he was physically sitting at each of them place, moving physically around the table and sitting at their place to connect to them and just connect to their mind and see at that situation problem which he wanted to solve from their point of view. Yes, this has reminded me about this, that yeah, physical, that you don't just look at from your place, you just go around the table. And also Bob Proctor, who was my mentor, he also shared this about when we learned about perception. He said
Mhm.
that whenever you have a problem, first of all, write it on the paper. Take it out of your head. Write it on the paper with all details, like as more details as you can. Just take this all out so it is not in your head, and then put this paper in the middle of the table, and then
Mhm.
look at this situation from your perspective. Yeah, this is situation, this happened, this, all details. Then move and sit in another place and say, what if that would be, let's say, I don't know,
Mhm.
John Kennedy or whatever,
Right.
how he would look, and anybody else, how he would look. And moving like this and just looking at things from different people perspectives can open that big huge diapason of possible solutions which we might not see when we look at things only from our point of view.
And I think even beyond that, Elena, even beyond that, sometimes the exercise I have people do is, and this is, by the way, even the exercise, I've done with my students, even with Russia and Ukraine, right? So someone asked me, okay, if I was a mediator for this conflict, and look, this conflict is nowhere in a place where it's ready to be mediated. I also want to acknowledge something, right? Before something is mediated, there has to be accountability and responsibility, right? There has to be accountability. There has to be shared humanity. We cannot be just negotiating when that is not present. However, once that is present, the place I would start is, what would it take for Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Zelensky to both deliver victory speeches? What would it take for these two leaders, right, at war, at a very intense war, to deliver victory speeches? In delivering victory speeches, where the rule is, it's not just, okay, complete annihilation of the other. It's what are their needs, and is there a way to meet their needs and needs of the respective people without taking away from someone else? Can we find that 18th camel? And so sometimes it's even, when we are in conflict with people, with other entities, where we begin and how we change the perspective is we actually write out a victory speech from their perspective. What is it that they're seeking? Can we truly understand not only their position, but their interests, their emotions, their values, and their needs? And if we can, right? If we can, then instead of negotiating from positional level, instead of negotiating from domination, who's going to dominate the other person more, none of these things ever are going to last, right? If it's purely based on power and domination, we start
Mhm.
negotiation from the needs. What are the fundamental needs and how can we meet them? And how can we get to the place where we have the 18th camel, right? Where everyone is able to get what they need without taking away from someone else.
Yes, I wish everyone would listen to our podcast and learn from you, especially those politicians, yes, who now affect so many people lives, unfortunately, in negative way.
Right.
Yes, thank you so much, Henry. It was such amazing conversation we had, and I'm sure that it is a lot to learn, and everyone can listen to this many times because there's so many lessons which you shared from your experience. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to meet you again so we can record more conversations.
Sounds great, Elena. And if I may just mention, if you listeners are looking to connect with me, I am online. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. My webpage is www.livingpeaceinstitute.com. And also, I have this book out. It's called Dissolving Conflict from Within: An Inner Path for Conflict Transformation. It's available worldwide on Amazon Audio. It's available in North America, everywhere books are sold, in all major book retailers. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. We will put all your contacts, how people can find you, in the
Mhm.
description of this video. And of course, I'm sure that your book has so much to learn from. Yes, thank you so much, Henry.
Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome.